بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
I'd like to introduce Adam Deen.
I will remove this picture so it doesn't become annoying. I'd like to begin by thanking the Islamic Society here for inviting me. I think it's my first time here, is that correct? Yes. And also like to thank everyone that's turned up, and hopefully you'll find it informative and also enjoyable. I had one. So, as Muslims, we believe in a transcendent being that is all-powerful, all-knowing, and is the locus of all that is moral and good. And what concerns us this evening is those attributes that define God's moral essence. As Muslims, we believe that God has revealed 99 names, and of which are moral are compassionate, kind, merciful, just, and a doer of good. There are some atheists who have argued that the existence of a being with these attributes contradicts the evil in the world, and that if God did actually exist, it would ultimately be an evil God. And typically what's used to argue for this is what's known as the problem of evil. The fact that God's attributes of being all loving and being all powerful is incompatible with the evil and suffering in the world. Now, what I'd like to do this evening is provide a cogent response to the problem of evil, so that we can rescue the notion that God is good. Thank you. Now, typically, the problem of evil comes in two forms. The first is what's known as the logical problem, the fact that the existence of God and its moral attributes are in contradiction, that there's a logical contradiction with the existence of suffering and evil and the attribute of being all loving and being powerful. Now, those propositions, if you like, that seem to or seemingly contradict one another are an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God exists and evil exists. And what the advocate of such an argument is saying, that these two propositions cannot be both true. They can be both false, but they cannot be both true. So one has to go. And when we observe the world, obviously there is evil, there is some type of suffering. So then it logically follows then that the first proposition, that an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God does not exist. But the problem here is that there is not an explicit contradiction here. Because for there to be an explicit contradiction, it would mean P and not P. For example, if I said all basketball players are tall, and I also said all basketball players are not tall, that is an explicit contradiction. And in the case of those two propositions we just spoke about, that is not the case. So what there is, there seems to be here are hidden assumptions behind those propositions. What are those hidden assumptions? They are the following. If God is omnipotent, then he can create any world he desires, since he is powerful. And the second, or the fourth premise, if you like, is God is omnibenevolent, and therefore he prefers a world where there is no evil. So there's two things here, that he can create any world, and he also prefers a world where there's no evil. So what this means is that if God is an all-loving, powerful being, then he must create a world where there's no evil. surely he would prefer that, because if he loves us, then he would naturally follow that he would create a world where there's no evil. Now, what I'd say here is that this is not a sufficient argument against the existence of an all-loving God. And just to continue, David Hume also summarizes the logical version. He says that, is he willing to prevent evil but not able? Then is he impotent? Is he able but not willing? Then is he malevolent? Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? So Hume is saying here that if he is able to create a world with no evil and doesn't, then he must be evil. If he does want a world where there's no evil, and that is not the case, then he can't be all-powerful. But that obviously those 2 points won't do us any good for arguing for God's existence in a traditional sense. So, now my argument here is that 3 and 4 are actually flawed propositions, that this does not actually make sense, that the assumptions behind here aren't going to do any justice. Now, how to enlighten this problem, I think it's important to outline what do we mean by omnipotent. We mean that God is able to do anything that is logically possible. And, for example, it would not make sense to ask the question, can God create a square circle? It would not make sense to ask that question, because this is an illogical proposition. Because a square must have 4 sides, a circle has 1 side. Something cannot have 4 sides and 1 side at the same time. So this type of question does not make sense. What we mean by God's omnipotent power is that he can do what's logical, what's intelligible. It's a bit like asking, can God catch a bus? That doesn't make sense, right? Now, with that said, what is the atheist or the advocate of the problem of evil arguing here? He's saying God should create a world where every being chooses good over the bad. Every being chooses good over the bad. Only good exists. But there's something that's not taken into consideration here, and that is free will. In order for God to create a world where we freely choose something, where he makes us freely choose something, free will loses all meaningful expression. It does not make sense. You cannot forcefully make someone choose good. That is a contradiction in terms. So effectively, the assumption that God would create a world where only good exists ends up with a contradiction. Because we cannot have free will and at the same time have a world where we can guarantee that good always exists. So that, in that sense, that assumption is false. However, one could say, so we can conclude that free will, the agency, is negated if that's the case. But one could say then, well, what about premise 4, that God prefers a world where only good actually materializes? Why couldn't he just create a world where he does force people to be good and be moral all the time? Why hasn't he created that? Surely he prefers that. Well, again, that is a problem, because it's a contradiction in terms. Because morality presupposes free will. You cannot have moral agents, you cannot have morality if people are forced to do good. What do I mean by this? Suppose I put a gun to the brother's head and I said to him, give money to charity, and he does. Can we praise him for giving money to charity? No, because free will is not in play here. He was forced to do that. So God is not interested in developing robots, moral robots. What he wants is a world where we freely choose to be good. So it is not the case that God would prefer a world where only people do good, or forced to do good, over a world where people freely choose morality to be good. That is not the case. So that is a false assumption. But at this point, one could the proponents of the problem of theory, of the problem of evil, could say, okay, fine, I abandon this case where it is a contradiction, is a logical contradiction. But what I will do is argue that it is most probable that God doesn't exist, given the amount of evil and suffering in the world. Okay, it's not a logical contradiction, but looking at it from probabilistically, it seems that there's so much evil and that it is pointless. Therefore, God does not exist. Well, a God that is all-loving, that is. Now, there's three things I'd like to say in response to this idea. And that is to say that probabilities are relative to a backdrop. Probabilities only make sense if you have a given backdrop. So, if I was to say that we have Jack, who's a university student, and 90% of students play football, so it's a high probability that Jack likes football. But if I give you some additional information from the background, and I say that Jack is actually disabled, and 90% of disabled individuals do not play football, then the probability of him not playing football goes down. So those probabilities only make sense given the background information. Now, when we're talking about God, an all-loving God does not exist, or God does not exist given the probabilistically, well, probable relative to what? Now, if we only had, as a backdrop, pain and suffering in the world, then fair enough. One could infer, most probable, that is, that God doesn't exist. But that is not the situation at hand. We have a tremendous amount of independent evidence within that background. For example, God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe. God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. We have also claims to revelation, like, for example, the Quran, that the only explanation for the Quran's authorship is divine. We have many arguments in the background that suggest that God does exist. So, relative to what? Relative to what? That's the question. I don't think that actually provides a very good argument. To say that relative to the background information, which is pain and suffering, because that's not all that we're dealing with. The second point I'd like to argue is that to claim that the evil and suffering in the world is pointless is an argument from ignorance. It's an argument from ignorance. Now, what I would say here is that from our limited framework, limited scope, we are not in a position to make those probabilistic judgments. That we cannot make those judgments and say, this act is ultimately bad. This act that is ultimately going to be good. We're not in that position to make those kind of judgments. Now, to help us with this kind of reasoning, we can look to another area, which is utilitarianism. It's an ethical principle which says to provide the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. Now, within this theory, there is a problem, a genuine problem, irrespective of God and religion. That is to say that we cannot determine what something is good in the short term will ultimately be good in the long term. It may be bad, right? And vice versa. Something that's seen bad might ultimately be good. And this is a genuine problem. Why is that? Because we do not have those resources to make those kinds of judgments. It could well be that God has morally sufficient reasons to allow the finite suffering in the world, and this is the crux of the argument in defense, and I think it's perfectly possible to argue in this way, that God may have morally sufficient reasons to allow the evil and suffering in the world because of a greater good. This could be the situation. And we are in no position to argue against it. How can we make that judgment? Just because we do not see the good in the ultimate evil in the world, it doesn't mean it does not exist. What I would here again mention is something that I witnessed on TV. It was a program called Embarrassing Bodies. Yes, it is embarrassing sometimes. I turn the channel at that point. But on this particular show, they had a young girl who was suffering from this severe fungus, this kind of infection on her foot. And it was very, very aggressive. And literally, her entire foot was covered with this kind of fungus, if you like. Completely covered like what would look like warts, if you like. And the parents were agonizing over their child. And there was I recall a clip where the parents were saying that we would, at night we would just ask, why did this happen? They would ask God, why did this happen? Why our little girl? Now what was interesting is, on this show, they actually took the little girl to an expert. And what they found was that she was suffering her immune system was suffering with a problem, which was a disease that was attacking her immune system. And what was happening is because her body could not fight that fungus. But this is the key point. What they said was, had she not come then, she would have died from this illness. So, yes, the fungus was bad at that time. It was agonizing. But had it not been for that diagnosis, she would have died from an illness. Had her body not reacted in that way to give her a warning to say something is up, then she would have died from an illness. And there is an insightful verse in the Quran that speaks about our lack of foreknowledge, our lack of knowledge, that we are in no position to make a judgment about the evil in the world. And the Quran talks about when Allah, God, created Adam, alayhi salam. And the angels, they only do good. They are those beings that we were talking about before. They only perform good. And out of curiosity, they said, hold on, humans are being created, but the problem is that they're quite mischievous. They can cause a lot of problems. We've seen this happen before. And they went to God and they said, out of curiosity, they wanted to know the wisdom. They said, why are you creating this person? Why are you creating man? And God says, I know what you do not know. I know what you do not know. So in the grand scheme of things, God has foreknowledge and an understanding that we lack. We do not have that foresight. So to argue that the evil in the world is pointless is simply arguing with ignorance. It's pure speculation. The task that let's say the atheist has is to prove that the evil is pointless. That is the burden the atheist shoulders. And lastly, what I would say here is this. The very apprehension of the category evil presupposes that objective morality exists. Ask yourself this question. If there is no God, can we rescue the notion of objective morality? I do not think you can. There is no such thing as objective morality. Because if there is a God, then morality is grounded in God, a transcendent being. If there is no transcendent being, then morality becomes an illusion. It loses all meaning. But ask yourself this. When the atheist says, that's evil, where are they getting this idea of evil? That understanding of evil must exist. That category of good and evil must exist. But I submit to you that the only way that that category can exist if it is grounded in God. So in actual fact, if objective evil does not exist, then it exists, then God exists. Objective evil exists, therefore God exists. So in actual fact, what we find is that the problem of evil on the surface looks like a problem, but when we have philosophical pondering, we find that the argument actually proves that God exists. And not only that, that there is a moral being. Now, I don't want to just end there by showing that we can argue sufficiently against the idea that an all-loving, all-powerful God is compatible with the existence of evil. I don't want to just end there. What I want to say is that it is actually a problem for atheism, not theism. How so? Well, let me read to you an extract from Samuel Jackson, not the actor, but in his article, The Prose of Suffering and Patience of Silence. And what he does here, he speaks of or writes about his interview that took place with a lady called Fina Kamara. And she was a victim of the Sierra Leone civil war. And I just want to read this to you. He said, "We were hiding in a bush for 3 months." She began. "We were afraid of the RUF might come at any time and attack the town. But then we received messages from the Free Town and from the ECOMOG to come out of the bush and return to town. So we came out of the bush. One day we went to our farm to plant groundnuts. We returned to the town, and that afternoon suddenly we heard gunshots. Now, because there were ECOMOG soldiers in Camdimbia, we used to hear firing all the time, but this time we were confused. The RUF came suddenly. They shot many people. They stacked the bodies under the cotton tree. Then they grabbed us. Their leader said that they were going to kill us. But then they sent a boy to bring a knife. My daughter, Damba, was 6 at the time. They took her from me and cut off her hands. After that, they cut off all of our hands. One man died because of the bleeding. We fell to the ground. After some time, we got up. Damba said, 'Mummy, I'm thirsty.' By now, all the houses were on fire. We went behind one of the houses. One RUF boy came and said to me, 'What are you doing here?' I said, 'I want to give my daughter some water.' I gave Damba some water. Then I sat down and tied her to my back. We began running again, but they stopped us in the backyard of one of the homes. One RUF girl said, 'You move one more step and I'll shoot you.' I had to stay back. A little while later, I overheard the RUF soldiers. They saying that it's time to leave. Then they had gone. When they had gone, I picked up my small son, Damba, my daughter, Damba, on my back and went to the bush. From there, I came out on the road and sat down. I met my husband and uncle there. And in the morning, we set off to Kabbalah. We did not reach Kabbalah that day because of the pain. It took us 2 days to get there. People in Kabbalah said we were lucky. The Red Cross were there. After treating us, they brought us by helicopter to Freetown here. We were taken to Coconut Hospital. They treated us there. Then we were taken to Waterloo. Then the RUF invaded Freetown and we had to flee Waterloo. We fled to the stadium. From there, we were brought to this camp. If you ask me, this is all I know. We were ordinary people. We were farmers. We had nothing to do with the government. Whenever I think about this and about the time they cut off my hand and my daughter's hand, who was only 6 years of age, I feel so bad. I wish the war was over. I wish the war was over. Now, folks, my friends, brothers and sisters, what justice will Fena see? What hope does she have? If life ends at the grave, so does justice. Justice ends there as well. Think of all the torture that we have witnessed on the news. Think of all the rape and genocide. Thousands and millions of people have been at the hands of evil men, evil women, tyrants. If life ends at the grave, when will these people see justice? However, if God does exist, then we know that righteousness will be rewarded. Evil will be punished, and God will balance the scales of justice. We know that one day all will be judged. So evil is not a problem for theism, it is a problem for the one who does not believe in God. Thank you for listening.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم
We have to understand that God does not want to infringe on free will. Most of the problems that we have, evil and suffering, are at the hands of human beings. The suffering that, let's say, for example, that exists in the world it pales in comparison to the evil that is caused by man. And there's an interesting interview which I came across, and it was to do with the Holocaust. And the Holocaust was a very, very disturbing event, not just for the Jewish community, but for ethical philosophers. Because at that time, they could not believe how evil people could be. And when they had this rabbi who's a Jewish scholar, and they asked this rabbi, they said, where was God when the Holocaust was happening? And his answer was fantastic. He said, where was man? Where was man when innocent people were being slaughtered and put in gas chambers, for example? So we really do have to put things into perspective. The problem is not God, the problem is us. Now, and the main argument was that because we do need free will. We can't expect to have free will and then God intervening every so often. I mean, that wouldn't be a real world, that would be a ghost house. You know, you're walking down and then God says, psst, you know, there's a nail on the floor, don't step on it, move to the other side. That would be quite a ridiculous kind of world to live in. So yeah, I would add that. So let me go. If God created everything, God created evil, right? Evil is not an entity. St. Augustine argued this very well. He said that evil is not an entity in itself. Evil is a privation of the good. It's a deficit of the good. So it's not an actual thing itself. That makes sense. It's not an entity that we go, oh, that's good, but it's a lack of good. It's a minus of good, if you want. Right? That's an explanation for that. Again, I think there's an assumption, the reason that you're having difficulty is there's an assumption that somehow God creates people that are good and God creates people that are evil, but that's wrong. God creates us in a neutral position. And it is up to us to choose good and evil. He does not create us, because that would be evil. If he created someone that was evil and then punished him in the afterlife for being evil, that would really be nasty. But the Islamic tradition is that he creates them in a neutral position, in a fitra. And the fitra, the disposition, is that he knows, the disposition actually knows its Lord. And by using reason and revelation, we come to recollect God again. So the fitra is this normal state. So that would be a problem if we assume that God did actually create people good and evil. But that's not the case. Okay, so first thing about the unfairness. Well, you see, the question I would say here is, within what scope? If it is unfair from your limited scope, that it is unfair because that person is born here and that person is born there. But in the wider scale, that person will have, let's say, in the afterlife, be infinitely compensated for that treatment. What we have to understand is that God allows us in the world where at best that we will come to know Him. So, again, it's to claim it's unfair within the limited scope of existence is a speculation. You have to look at it in the grand scheme of things. You can't just say it's unfair. How do you know it's unfair? Maybe that person in the afterlife, because of the torments that they went through in this life, will get infinitely rewarded that you won't, for example. And then one could say, I know what you're going to say, well, is that unfair? No? Okay. Well, one could then say that maybe that's the best situation for you, because if you were in that situation, maybe that wouldn't be the best situation for you to come to your Lord. But maybe the best situation for you to come to your Lord, so it's equal maybe in the situation that you're in. Maybe the situation that she's in. And by the way, if she dies, she enters into paradise because she has died in that situation. What we find is that the victims in the tsunami, in actual fact, what you think is them to be angry with God, but it's actually the reverse. The strength and the commitment to faith has been increased, which is contrary to what people would think, right? Because, look, in our day-to-day life, we know that this makes sense. No pain, no gain. Right? We know this from the mundane, we can understand. The point is, why can't that be true of the extraordinary? Why can't that be true for the extraordinary? That in order for us to benefit, we must have some pain in our lives. Look, I've been in that, look, from a personal perspective, when my life has been very, very comfortable, I've taken it for granted. And when I had some hardship, two things happened. That I appreciated what I had before, and it made me a better person, and therefore I was in a position to, when I was in a position to make other people have a better life, just as I had, I went out my way to do that. So these tests and trials that we have in our lives, they are those, for those who've seen the film Matrix, the shudder of the Matrix. Because sometimes we become deluded and we start to believe this Matrix, this world that we live in. What pain and suffering does in our lives, it shakes that and says, wake up. And that's what happens, and that's the point of pain and suffering. As one possible explanation of why we have this in our lives.
Is
degrees.
Are there different degrees?
Yes, there are degrees. There are degrees in the afterlife.
So there's like segregation.
Yeah, there are degrees according to how segregation is a bit of a,
How much punishment?
that's a bit of a hard word to use. Apartheid. I would say there are degrees of justice, not segregation. There are degrees of justice according to how one lived in life. The question is hell eternal? And the reason this is an important question, because our friend here is saying that it's disproportionate. And this is the argument. How can a finite amount of sinning amount to an infinite amount of time punishment? Yes? Yeah. Okay. That's the gist of the argument. There are two responses to this. There is the view, one could argue that maybe as a question mark, that maybe it isn't, that there it is, but this is a fringe view that people have argued that maybe it isn't and it does come to an end, right? The other argument that no, it is, but the question is who goes to hell forever? Who? It is not people, and this will put this into context, it is not people who do not believe. It is people who intentionally know it is the truth and reject. Overtly saying, I don't give a damn, like it or lump it. Those people will be in hell. Now, one could argue and say, well, isn't that too much? Well, think of it like this. Suppose you had someone and you said to them, look, stop smoking, because you're going to end up with cancer. And they said, no, it won't, come on, it's not going to happen, is it? And lo and behold, 10 years later, he has cancer. And then you say to him, look, you've got cancer, quit now whilst you're ahead. And he said, look, you know what, I don't really care. I do not care, and I'm going to carry on smoking. And he carries on, and guess what happens? He has cancer. And guess what? He still carries on smoking, and unfortunately dies. Do you think that he is responsible for that cancer? Just intuitively, would you say he's responsible? He had all the warnings on the cigarette packet. He had someone, a counsellor, seeing him day in, day out, saying, look, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Now, God, in his infinite power and infinite foreknowledge, has created a situation for all of us that we continuously get these kind of matrix shudders, if you like, and signs for us to do away with our arrogance. Do away with our arrogance so that we can come and know God. He gives us an infinite amount of possibilities that we can actually know him. The best possible place. Now, someone could argue that, again, that doesn't seem to wash over. Well, let's sort of base on a principle in our day-to-day lives. do we punish someone differently if, for example, if they chop down a tree, compared to if they killed someone? True? Or let's say a third category, an animal. If someone killed an animal, we would not treat them in the same way if they killed a human being, right? Because the being in question is very different, a different category. So why could we not argue that if one is offending, is going against, is declaring war, if you like, intellectually, or arrogantly going against an infinite being, then that person requires an infinite punishment? I think that's quite intuitive. I think the way in which we make those categories, because we don't say if you cut a blade of grass, you should be in prison for 25 years for manslaughter. We don't say that, do we? We make a distinction with the beings. And then one could argue, I'm just saying this is a possible explanation, I don't know necessarily it is the answer, but it's a possible answer, that the being involved here is an infinite being, therefore it equates to an infinite punishment. That's one answer.
You believe that?
I
would love to have, just because I don't believe in God, it creates...
Oh, we're not talking about what I believe in. We can have a conversation later. I'm giving you arguments that would dispel your position. It's not necessarily the case that it's disproportionate, because your measurement, I would say, is a false one. Who would say it's disproportionate? And if you say it is evil, you would also have to demonstrate that objective evil exists. But if objective evil only exists if it's grounded in God, then you come around that problem again. You see, where are you getting this argument that it's evil, that it's disproportionate? You see, there are a lot of assumptions there where we would need to engage a bit further.
I don't think you're getting assumptions. You're making an assumption of
No.
God and punishment and hell and everything else.
No. There is an assumption there. It's disproportionate is the assumption.
Well, I prefer to believe that solidarity rather than...
Remember what I said to you? I said that there's an argument that says it's not. I'm giving you all the arguments that in response. Well, it's not convincing that it's not eternal. Because that would be convincing, if that's the answer that you're looking for. Because then it would be proportional.
Everything is not convincing.
Okay, well, we can talk afterwards.
Just, you know what you're saying to him? And he said that you could stay, you do one bad thing, you can go hell all the time. It flips the other way as well, because you could do one thing that's pleasing to Allah, and they give you Jannah.
Yeah, and just to add to that, his mercy overcomes his wrath. You have to understand that God is constantly trying to find ways in which that He can forgive your sins. But I think his discussion is, okay, fine, given that, but if we do have someone X, yeah. This is a very, very interesting question. And I think we need to set the stage here. Even if that all of my arguments fail this evening, or every single one failed, it does not prove that God does not exist. It only shows that God is not all-loving. Right? It does not justify atheism. Right? I just wanted to state that point. So we need to know the limits of our arguments. Yeah, we'll come back to you. Yeah, I've not finished yet.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'll get back to you. Right? It does not prove that God does not exist. Your question is relative. It does not necessarily mean that. God judges according to your environment. The Islamic perspective is our salvation is relative to the environment and the information that you have. So not necessarily the case, no. That does not equate to that.
Would it have to assume a greater knowledge of Islam? Like, what would be the knowledge of Islam at which I would be condemned?
Not the knowledge, it's your comprehension. If you...
Okay, the comprehension.
Yeah, your comprehension that God exists and that Muhammad was a messenger. But you might have been... that he was a messenger, the last messenger, for example.
I mean, I'm familiar with that. You know, I did religious studies at school. I have access to the internet. I have some familiarity with the major
if you're asking where you're going, I don't know. Yeah, that's for God. Yeah. All I can tell you is theoretically, I can't go into your mind. I can't know your heart. I mean, for all you know, that I might be going a different place. We don't know. We're not talking about this.
I'm not lying.
No. I'm not saying you're lying, my friend. I'm not saying. I can just tell you hypothetically that I cannot judge where you're going. That's for God. I can just tell you the theory, and then we'll see what happens. Justice, and yes, it's all very nice, it's all hunky-dory after we die, it does not mean it's true. Agreed. I was not arguing this evening that justice in the afterlife provides evidence that God exists. I was saying if God exists, then we're in a better position than, let's say, atheism. And you can't deny that. Because even if we said that, okay, fine, it's an imagination and we'll just pretend that it's an imagination, psychologically it provides us more resources to live with life, to have hope, to have cosmic hope. And man does need hope. But if we truly do believe that life ends at the grave, it does paint a very bleak picture of our existence. Right? If I were to argue as a Muslim, then I'd just say, look, it says in the Quran that there are trials and tribulations to make me a better human being, and to say that's the end of it. I'm not arguing as a Muslim. I'm arguing philosophically. I'm saying if God exists, then we can argue, being a possibility, that there are morally sufficient reasons that you're unaware of. Look, let me give you an analogy. May I do that? Yeah, good. Okay. Suppose now we have a room in there. That's a room that when you open the door, there's an individual in there. And I give everybody in this room an envelope. And on this envelope, there's a piece of information. Right? There's a piece of information on this envelope. You're not allowed to open the envelope until I say so. Now, we ask this brother, we ask him to go in the room first, but he doesn't have the envelope. Only you are privileged, because I like you so much. You have the envelope. So this brother goes into the room and he sees a man chopping someone's leg off. And the man is screaming. And the person committing this crime, let's say, shows no mercy. He is going all the way. And the blood is squirting everywhere, and it's a horrific scene. He comes rushing out and goes, that's so evil. So evil. How could this be happening? Then I ask everyone else to go in there, and you experience the same horrific scenario, and you come out. All of you are shocked by what you've seen. But then you open the envelope, and it says that the man who is cutting the leg off is a doctor. And the man suffering, he has gangrene on his leg, and if he doesn't cut it off, he will die. Then all of you change emotionally and think, but this brother doesn't have it. He's still saying, it's evil, it's evil. Now, what I'm saying here is that the envelope is God's knowledge. You do not have that. But do you see how knowledge changes everything? It contextualizes the evil and suffering. And my point is ultimately, you cannot argue that the evil and suffering is pointless. I have to answer his first because we have to be fair, otherwise it will be evil. Yes, often this kind of objection creates what's called as a category mistake in philosophy, that having knowledge of future events has no bearing on the category of causation. Just because God knows, it does not necessarily mean he determines by knowing. So it could well be the case that God has foreknown and created beings with free knowledge, and that he knows the outcome. Those are not necessarily contradictions. To claim that there would be a category mistake. That's in a nutshell. Again, you're confusing the point. Yes, it is written, but that's God's foreknowledge, but not causation. There's two separate things. Yeah? Just because it's written, that's to do with God's ability, his power. But that doesn't necessarily logically follow that he causes.
Yeah, but would that not be evil of him to place me in a place that makes me more evil?
No, he does not put you in a place that makes you more... Again, the assumptions are wrong.
Yeah. But
Devil's evil. Again, the assumption is wrong. God does not put you in actually, God puts you in a place that the best place to bring out the goodness in you. It's the other way around. But it is you who say, you're like the person who smokes. I don't care, I don't care. The analogy that I gave.
So would the right thing to say to someone be the fact that God is such a power that He's got the ability to know what we don't because we're human?
Yes. It's His power, it's His ability. Look, I said to my daughter once, you know what, my daughter is 9 years old and she actually asked me this question. Yeah? We were eating one day and I dropped the fork and the knife. I was like, what's going on here? And then she asked me a question and I said, look, and I tried to break it down to her. I said to her, look, do I know you? My daughter's called Layla. I said, Layla, do I know you? She said, yes, Daddy, you do know me. I said, if we went to the shops and I said, choose a toy, and would I get it right? She said, yeah, most definitely you would get it right, because you know all the things that I like, and you just know me so well. And I said, go and buy a gift, don't tell me. And I wrote down, and I said to her, did you buy this? And she said, yes. Now, did I cause you to go and do that? No, but I had this ability to know. Inside me, because I know you, so I have that ability, right? Now, this is a sort of a crude example to give, because what we're dealing with is what we have. We don't have God's infinite knowledge and infinite power. It's infinite insight to know that, right? You must understand this, that the ability to know does not translate into I caused. Category mistake to say they're one and the same thing. What I would say here is that what we know about the universe now, that it is finite, that it has an origin, and that anyone who believes that the universe has a finite past and has an origin is well within mainstream science. And what we say is that the universe, by definition, must have had a cause because it has a beginning. Because whatever begins to exist needs to have a cause, right? And that cause must be outside of time and space by definition, because the universe has an edge. Because the universe, by definition, is all space, time, and matter. That's just in a nutshell. I think that's a very caricatural view of what I was saying. I wasn't saying that religion answers these questions. What I was saying is that if we look at modern science, it actually conforms to the view within religion. I'm not saying we ignore science and we just use religion to argue that God created the universe. I'm saying that modern science, contemporary cosmology, if you like, holds up the view that the universe was created. It's almost a false dichotomy that's assumed within your question, as if there were like this view that it's either religion or science. Well, no, I don't subscribe to that view. I don't think that's a necessary dichotomy that I have to sort of entertain.
It's the fact that you're making claims that science has been attempting to answer, whereas
Would you believe a scientific claim if it conformed to what a religious book said?
not as a result of religious books saying...
No, I said if a scientific experiment conformed with a fact within a religious text, would you believe in that scientific fact?
Yeah.
Okay, we're even there. We're doing the same thing. We actually have facts in our religious texts, like the Quran, for example, that are backed up by modern science. And the reality is that the universe has a finite beginning. You cannot deny that. There's by using thermodynamics, second law of thermodynamics, that the universe is going to end up in an equilibrium and have a heat death, means that the universe does have an origin and we haven't got there yet, and it's still going to get there. There's many experiments support the fact that the universe has an origin. Your point is, the onus is not on me, because this is your argument. This is the argument from atheism. It is your job to show me that your argument makes sense, not for me to actually sit there and argue for you. Because your claim is that this argument, that the suffering and evil is pointless. How do you know that? Because remember, I'm saying if God exists, there could be a morally sufficient reason. If. Is that logically possible, that statement? Yes, perfectly logically possible. Perfectly logically, but just take my word for it. It's perfectly logical. Now, I've done my job as a theist. The atheist has that burden that he has to show that it is not morally sufficient to have the evil and suffering. So we must not shift the burden on the theist here, because then we would be intellectually insincere. It is your task. Now, if I said that God exists, for example, then I would have to argue and give some positive arguments why God exists. And the arguments would be that God is the best explanation of the universe, etc., etc. So we have to understand that the theist position is a position where he can argue that something is possible. As long as it's possible, then he is in a safe place. It is the task of the atheist, the task of the person who believes in the problem of evil, to show that it actually equates to what they're saying. It's not my task. It's not my task. Yeah?
About this.
Yeah. Okay. You see, this is the problem. This is why I said in the outset that this is an atheist argument. I'm not arguing that God is good because I can see good in the world and this brother's going to pay for my dinner after this lecture. Yeah?
You'll be lucky.
Yeah? I'm not arguing that. But what the atheist is doing, and I'm not picking anyone, I'm just saying the atheist, I'm just acting as the atheist. He's saying evil, 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 evil. Oh my God, there's no God. I'm not saying God is good because I see good, 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 good. I have different arguments for that. The argument of objective morality, that's something else. Do you see? There's a subtle difference there, but it has a profound effect on the argument. Look, I'm saying, if God exists, if, it's a conditional statement, I'm saying if he exists, we cannot exclude that he has morally sufficient reason for the evil in the world. I'm not saying that evil is justified because God exists. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if he exists, we cannot exclude the possibility that God has morally sufficient reasons for the evil and suffering in the world because of a greater good. You can't exclude that. Otherwise, you would have to be God to know that. That's going a bit too far.
We send murderers to prison or not?
If your question is to do with what's the basis of morality, I find it very difficult to establish the existence of morality if God does not exist. Because from a theistic perspective, the idea that we know that murder is wrong, we can all appreciate it, and it is actually okay, let me think of it like this. Is morality a matter of fact? Put your hands up if you think it's a matter of fact. That good and evil exist. Okay. The question, is this bottle here, or is that bottle hard, is that a matter of fact? Raise hands. Welcome here. Some haven't raised their hands, and I'm really worried. Maybe in time. Yes, because we know that we can justify that claim, the bottle is hard, because we can empirically verify it. But then how do we verify that stabbing someone is evil? Stabbing someone is wrong. Hume spoke about this. He said, if you see a man being stabbed, you see a vice. He says, where is the evil? Is it there? Is there an arrow saying evil, evil, evil? No. He said, it's in your breast. It's within you. But he said, but that's just a feeling. What gave feelings a right to be objective and to start dictating in the world? So Hume's point was that morality is this kind of weird notion. It has these, and J.L. Mackie, the late J.L. Mackie from Oxford, he said that morality has a property that is really alien to us. It's not physical, It doesn't have structure. It's not like a chemical. You cannot find morality in a test tube, right? So what is this thing called good and evil? Where does it exist? And my point here is that if we believe in God, then we can adequately rescue the notion of morality and have a sense of morality, because it can be transcendent and grounded in God. So our apprehension of what is good or what is evil, even if you're non-Muslim, when you know it's good to give money to the poor, to give charity, that apprehension is apprehension of God's mercy and compassion. But if we only live in a material world, then where is this peculiar notion of good and evil? Where is this morality? Where is it? Where do we find it? Is it under the table? Where is it? And this is a genuine problem in moral philosophy. Don't take my word for it. Look into it. I mean, J.L. Mackie actually, he said that either God exists, right, and objective morality exists, or God doesn't exist and objective morality doesn't exist. And guess what he concluded? That there's no objective morality. That there's no actual good and evil in the world. Genuinely, there's no good and evil in the world. And many prominent atheist philosophers, to be consistent with their worldview, will conclude this. To be consistent, and we have to credit them for their candor, because they're being consistent. And that's the argument. No, not really. I wouldn't say it's argument of ignorance. I'm actually giving an explanation. I'm giving a positive. I'm not saying it's not an argument of negation, it's actually a positive. Because if we can have a transcendence, then we could anchor God. Because the problem with... Okay, now I see where your question is going in. What is objective morality? Objective morality is something, irrespective of whether we believe in it or not, and transcends our cultural, social environment, right? But if we had a God, if we had a being that was outside of that, transcended our makeup, transcended the universe, then it would be objective. So I'm arguing not the negation. It's not an argument from ignorance. It's an argument from what we do know. If we had a being that was transcendent. So why does it make sense to attribute morality to God? As I've said, because in the realm of ontology, there's a fancy word of saying the grounding of morality, it only makes sense to ground it in something that is external of the universe. To ground it in the universe loses all meaning, because then it would not be objective. Because think about it, the universe, there's nothing special about it, there's nothing objective in the sense of being moral about it. It's just one big accident. And also, look, think of it like this. We have 13 billion years of the universe, and it's a case of, so the universe popped into existence, uncaused. We don't obviously believe that, but let's just argument's sake, let's carry on. And these particles came together, and the necessary and sufficient conditions were established with the planet so that sentient beings could exist. And then for the last 5% of this 13.5 billion years, we had these Homo sapiens popping up, evolving, let's say. Then suddenly, up until that point, so for 13.5 billion years, minus 5% of that time, there's no concept of morality. Then suddenly, bang, with us, there is this morality. That's arbitrarily put there. Why would that exist? Look, if we're animals, if we're advanced primates, then why would morality exist? Why would it be real? We cannot know that. I cannot say, I was really horrible to my mum this morning, that's why I missed the bus. Yeah, you cannot know that. But what you can know is that in a general sense, that God, and the only way that Muslims know that is because we have that in our book, the Quran, which is what we see as a communication from God, that this happens in our lives, that we do have punishment. God can punish us in this life and also the next life. But we, and this is the very important point, we're not in a position, we even admit that from the theist perspective, we even admit that we can't do that even when it serves us. We can't say, oh, that's bad, because we can't say a tsunami happened because you people, drink alcohol and don't wash your backsides. Something stupid like that. There are some silly people out there that believe that. We can't do that. Either way, we cannot do that. But we know in a general sense, conceptually, that happens. I think these are kind of intuitive questions. I think we shouldn't fall into a debate about semantics, what is good, what is evil. I think even from a secular perspective, we can appreciate we have commonalities with good and evil, like from a fundamental sense. Obviously, in more complicated matters, we may differ. For example, everyone believes, regardless of who they are, that torturing a child for fun is evil. Someone who's not Muslim, for example, someone who is, let's say, Christian, Hindu, whatever, they would all agree with that fact. So on a fundamental level, in a very general, abstract sense, we can all agree that there are similarities there. When it becomes to detailed areas, then we can differ. Then there's some kind of difference.